Imagine stepping into the grand salons of Gilded Age New York, where gaslit chandeliers glow against high ceilings, and the city's most fashionable names glide across polished parquet floors, whispering rumors about who's wearing what and which families have fallen from grace. In one of those stately brownstones on West 23rd Street, an infant's first cries pierced the winter air on January 24, 1862. She was Edith Newbold Jones, though for her first years, family and staff alike called her Pussy Jones. No one suspected that this shy girl with an insatiable hunger for books would one day become Edith Wharton, the first woman to receive the Pulitzer Prize, an indefatigable traveler who crossed the Atlantic 60 times, and the incisive chronicler of a closed world of old money and social codes. So, if you've ever heard the phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, well, that points directly to her father's side of the family. But let's rewind for a moment and wander with her through marbled foyers in Manhattan, lush gardens in Newport, and the war-torn roads of France, and witness how this unstoppable woman conquered a society that told her she couldn't. Born at the tail end of the American Civil War, Edith arrived into a stratum of life largely untouched by the turmoil devastating the nation. To her father, George Frederick Jones, and her mother, Lucretia Stevens Rhinelander, these harsh realities existed a world away. Their concern was more with the swift depreciation of currency than with the moral convulsions rattling the country. Soon enough, though, they would start traveling, partly out of a sense of adventure, partly to outrun the economic uncertainties that war had stirred. Their last child, small Edith, had two older brothers, Frederick Rhinelander Jones, father to Beatrix Farran, who would become a pioneering landscape architect, and Henry Edward Jones. Surrounded by wealth, the Jones siblings lived in a realm where elaborate dinner parties and strict codes of etiquette reigned supreme, and where distant cousins named Rensselaer or Astor added to the swirl of lofty connections. Edith, as a toddler, was inquisitive. She earned the family nickname Pussy, thanks to the way she would quietly observe everyone around her before pouncing with a surprising remark. This quick wit soon met with a mother who had no patience for the inner world of novels. Reading romance or fiction was considered frivolous, potentially even damaging to a young girl's moral fiber. But that only stoked Edith's fascination with storytelling. She'd tiptoe around, cracking open her father's books in the library, devouring pages with the unstoppable curiosity of a child starved for narrative. She also had a taste for conjuring her own tales. By age 4 or 5, she was walking around with an open book, reading aloud invented stories to her family or friends. Her mother would scold her, but the child was unstoppable. From 1866 to 1872, the Jones family embarked on an extended tour of Europe. This was partly to keep the family immersed in continental sophistication, partly to dodge the uncertain economy back home. They traveled to France, Italy, Germany, and Spain, establishing a pattern that Edith would maintain throughout her life. The unstoppable roam of a traveler, always hungry for new sights and new sources of inspiration. She absorbed languages with preternatural ease, becoming fluent in French, German, and Italian before she was old enough to question how extraordinary that was. At around 9, staying in a spa in the Black Forest, she nearly died of typhoid fever. This harrowing experience, though terrifying, perhaps deepened her sense that life was precious and precarious, a theme that would later echo in her writing's gentle but unflinching exploration of emotional fragility. Returning to America in 1872, the Joneses resumed their typical pattern of winters in Manhattan and summers in breezy Newport, Rhode Island, a place of sea-scented nights and lavish cottages that were anything but humble. Yet for all the social interplay, Edith found no shortage of reasons to keep reading. Tutors and governesses oversaw her education. Meanwhile, her mother famously decreed that she must not read novels until after marriage. Edith complied outwardly, but privately she rummaged through her father's library and borrowed from those belonging to older relatives, secretly reading everything from classics to contemporary works. She even started writing her own short pieces. Family tradition says that around age 11, she tried to draft a novel, a breach of parental discipline so severe that her mother quashed the project and forced her to pivot to poetry instead. The imaginative child found ways around these restrictions, determined to feed her creative hunger. Her earliest recognized publication came at 15 in 1877, a translation of a German poem in the New York World. The Joneses, anxious about a daughter with a public byline, insisted that it appear under someone else's name. High society regarded a girl's writing as an odd hobby at best, a scandal at worst. In 1878, her father privately printed a small booklet of her poems titled Verses, carefully controlling the distribution. None of this dampened her spirit. She wrote fervently, perfecting her style, even as the gates of mainstream publication remained closed. Societal expectations soon enveloped her. By 17, Edith came out as a debutante, symbolically introduced to New York's swirl of formal dances, drawing rooms, and potential suitors. She was suddenly permitted to wear her hair up, don evening dresses with open shoulders, and accompany her mother to the countless dinners and receptions that formed the social season. It was 1879, and the Gilded Age was in full throttle. Railroad tycoons, shipping magnates, and old money families all jockeying for prime status. Edith's mind, however, never stopped writing invisible stories about the people around her, the constraints of these lavish circles, the hidden aspirations or heartbreaks behind each polished facade. She briefly courted Henry Layden Stevens, whose family had made fortunes in hotels and real estate. But the Jones family bristled at the idea. Then at 19, her father fell ill. In 1881, they all decamped to Europe again, hoping the change of air might help. Instead, he died in 1882 in Cannes. Edith was suddenly fatherless, just 20, with an uncertain marital future, and a mother bent on controlling her destiny. In August 1882, soon after her father's death, an engagement to Stevens was announced. The wedding date approached, but the marriage never took place. Mysteriously canceled right before the big day. Possibly family disapproval, possibly personal doubt. People whispered, but society soon moved on. Edith's mother relocated to Paris, settling there until her death in 1901, leaving Edith somewhat adrift, but not for long. On April 29, 1885, at age 23, she wed Edward Teddy Wharton. He was older by 12 years, with an easygoing manner and a love of travel, reminiscent of her own upbringing. They set up household in Newport, occupying Pincraig Cottage at first, later acquiring Land's End in 1893, a picturesque property overlooking the sea. Edith took a keen interest in interior decoration, collaborating with the American designer Ogden Codman to transform the space. That partnership prefigured her later co-authorship with Codman of The Decoration of Houses in 1897, a seminal treatise on home design that argued for simplicity and classical lines over Victorian clutter. For the next decade, the Whartons lived a pattern that might have seemed idyllic from the outside. They traveled to Europe every year, spending months in Italy, France, and England, absorbing architecture, art, and cultural nuance, nourishing Edith's passion for aesthetics. She also began to produce more writing. While her mother and the broader circle in which she moved had discouraged her from serious publication, times were shifting. In the 1890s, her short stories began to appear in magazines. Her interest in Italy crystallized into the book Italian Villas and Their Gardens, 1904, featuring her reflections on design and horticulture. Her passion for houses morphed into a broader obsession with how environment shapes character. Yet these were also the years that tested her marriage. Teddy Wharton suffered bouts of depression. His mental health started sliding significantly by 1902, the same year Edith built the Mount in Lenox, Massachusetts, a house she designed meticulously to reflect her own architectural philosophies. It was there she wrote The House of Mirth, 1905, the novel that catapulted her to wide fame. Inside that stately mansion, she balanced the demands of social obligations with her unstoppable compulsion to write. Guests included the likes of Henry James, who admired her keen observation of the upper crust. But behind the glittering dinner parties, her husband's condition gnawed at the foundations. He grew unpredictable, jealous, unable to share her deeper intellectual passions. In 1908, Edith found a sense of emotional release through an affair with Morton Fullerton, a journalist for the Times of London. It was an intellectual and physical intimacy that she'd never truly felt in her own marriage. Meanwhile, the swirl of critics began labeling her as a naturalist or a realist. She was drawn to the social mores of her time, dissecting them with the precision of an anthropologist, shaped by her readings in Darwin, Spencer, and Nietzsche. Her style glowed with irony and an almost anthropological detachment, revealing a claustrophobic world of social codes. In 1913, Edith divorced Teddy, terminating 28 years of marriage. He was deemed incurable by doctors, and she had grown too exasperated by the mental strain. The dissolution scandalized some in her social sphere, but by then she was a formidable literary figure, someone with a robust circle of admirers, from Henry James to publisher Scribners. Freed from marital constraints, she relocated to France on a more permanent basis. Then came the Great War in 1914. While many Americans scrambled to flee Paris, Edith decided to stay put, viewing it as a moral imperative to help. She threw herself into philanthropic endeavors, raising funds for refugees, injured soldiers, and impoverished women. She co-founded committees like the American Hostels for Refugees, personally raising the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars. With her connections, she managed to secure permission to visit the front lines 5 times in 1915. She reported on the devastation for Scribner's magazine, later compiling her observations in Fighting France, from Dunkirk to Belfort. In recognition of her war service, French President Raymond Poincaré made her a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor in 1916. This once coddled society daughter had become a formidable humanitarian, commanding respect even among European officials. After the war, she settled about 10 miles north of Paris, in Saint-Brice-sous-Forêt, at an 18th century house she called Pavillon Colombe. Freed from the immediate demands of war relief, she resumed writing, though her perspective on life and society had sharpened. During these years, her stance as a fervent admirer of French imperialism emerged, visible in her visits to Morocco and her praise of the French colonial apparatus. She dubbed herself a rabid imperialist, an attitude that might strike modern readers as troubling, but which aligned with the viewpoint of many European-leaning elites of her day. In the post-war stretch of 1919 onward, she also returned to more personal creative pursuits. The result? The Age of Innocence, published in 1920, a novel dissecting the stifling codes of New York high society in the 1870s. Next year, 1921, that book made her the first woman ever to receive the Pulitzer Prize. though rumors persisted that the jury had initially favored Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, only to be overruled by the Columbia University Board. The outcome enshrined her status as a literary titan. She also continued traveling, summers and autumns at Pavillon Colombe, winters in the mild climate of Hyères on the French Riviera. Her circle of friends expanded to include the likes of Sinclair Lewis, André Gide, Jean Cocteau, and the erudite Bernard Berenson. She even had passing acquaintance with F. Scott Fitzgerald, though their meeting was apparently underwhelming, with Edith finding him somewhat chaotic. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, Edith's reputation soared. She was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1927, 1928, and 1930, never winning but underscoring her global esteem. She found time to produce an autobiography, A Backward Glance, published in 1934. True to her discreet style, she omitted certain delicate truths, like the full complexity of her mother's controlling ways or the depth of her affair with Fullerton. Yet it provided glimpses into her evolving worldview, shaped by a life that had moved from Manhattan ballrooms to the front lines of the Great War, from interior design theories to weighty novels about moral compromise. Meanwhile, her private life was calmer, but overshadowed by the mounting health issues of age. She had parted ways with the heartbreak of her first marriage, nursed the memory of her affair, and discovered a sense of self-reliance that was unusual for a woman of her generation. She never remarried. Instead, she built close friendships that traversed national borders and intellectual fields. She wrote about houses, gardens, love, betrayal, the constraints of aristocratic families. The House of Mirth, 1905, Ethan Frome, 1911, The Reef, 1912, The Custom of the Country, 1913, Summer, 1917, The Age of Innocence, 1920. Novel after novel, each offering a psychological slice of how hidden desires clash with rigid social demands. By 1937, approaching her mid-70s, Edith remained a formidable presence, poised, sharp-tongued when needed, fiercely protective of her creative independence. On June 1, 1937, while working with Ogden Codman on a revised edition of The Decoration of Houses, she suffered a heart attack. Then, on August 11th of that same year, a stroke claimed her life at about 5:30 p.m. She died in the house she adored, Pavillon Colombe, with her dear friend Mrs. Royal Tyler at her side. The news sent ripples through literary communities worldwide. Her funeral took place in Versailles, and she was buried in the American Protestant section of the Cimetière des Gonards. Even in death, France embraced her as if she were one of their own, honoring her achievements in war and in letters. The French, after all, had recognized her with the Legion of Honor. She was no mere foreign observer, but a woman who had woven her identity between old New York patrician circles and the high culture of Paris. Reflecting on the arc of Edith Wharton's life, one sees a tapestry of paradoxes. She was the child of a stifling social environment, yet she used that environment as the raw material for her scathing yet sympathetic critiques of upper-class hypocrisy. She was told as a girl that reading novels was a moral threat, only to become one of America's greatest novelists. She built a name as a design connoisseur, yet her major legacy rests in narratives like The House of Mirth and The Age of Innocence, works that unmask the lethal charms of old money. She revered the aristocratic tradition of Europe, yet found the bravery to challenge her own repressive social circle by divorcing. She championed French imperialism, praising its civilizing mission in Morocco, a stance that modern critics find discomforting. She orchestrated philanthropic efforts that saved countless refugees and war orphans. She offered a meticulously crafted persona to the public, but privately wrote about yearning, heartbreak, and the hush-hush truths of repressed love. One of the fascinations of her fiction is how houses become more than mere settings. They symbolize her characters' states of mind. In The Custom of the Country, The Age of Innocence, and beyond, each room, each piece of furniture, each garden archway resonates with social constraints or illusions of freedom. That impulse to merge environment with psychology traces back to her early mania for interior design. Perhaps it also echoes the home she grew up in, shifting from fancy brownstones to grand European rentals, then the cottages of Newport and the hillside estates of Lenox. Houses were her lens for exploring identity. Meanwhile, she devoured Darwin and Spencer, letting their evolutionary philosophies seep into her subtle comedic or tragic observations about humans jockeying for position in a social pecking order. She called Henry James a friend, but her style, while reminiscent of his in complexity, is more direct, less labyrinthine in its syntax. Some critics, like Hermione Lee, see Wharton's portrayals of strong, sometimes tyrannical maternal figures as literary vengeance. After all, this was the woman who forbade her from reading novels, who ridiculed her early attempts at writing, who tried to control her social destiny. Wharton found a measure of catharsis or retribution by crafting characters that expose the pettiness and destructive power of parents who see their children as pawns. She layered her pages with moral dilemmas that revolve around the weight of family obligation, the fear of scandal, and the cost of defiance in a tightly knit social matrix. It's worth noting how late her official career took off. She was around 40 when her first novel, The Valley of Decision, 1902, appeared. Before that, she had mostly contributed short stories or design essays, hardly recognized as a major force. Yet once the floodgates opened, her productivity was unstoppable. She wrote at least 15 novels, 7 novellas, and around 85 short stories, plus swaths of poetry, criticism, and her autobiography. She disliked the distinction between highbrow and genre writing, insisting that clarity and irony could elevate any theme. She served as a role model for younger female writers, showing that one could unify a life of social engagements, philanthropic activism, and unstoppable creative output. The same woman who circulated among the Astors, the Vanderbilts, and the exiled royals of Europe found time to pen chapters daily, on ship voyages across the Atlantic, in her meticulously curated gardens, or in her French library with its hush of books. Edith Wharton wrote about privilege, power, and passion, but her own story was just as complex and compelling as the lives she imagined. In an era when women were expected to stay silent and smile, she picked up a pen and spoke volumes. From glittering ballrooms to war-torn France, Wharton lived with purpose, wrote with clarity, and left behind a legacy that still shapes American literature today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below with your favorite Edith Wharton novel or which writer you'd like us to cover next. Until then, keep turning the pages and discovering the stories that shaped the world.